We're going to be taking a portion of scripture that you can find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I'm going to be in Matthew 16. And in the notes that you get on Monday, it'll also show you the other passages if you want to do like a cross-referencing, whatever. They're all pretty much the same. But they all present a question, or revelations, and challenges for any of us and all of us developing a deeper relationship with Christ. Which developing a deeper relationship might as well be synonymous with spiritual growth. Actually moving forward in this newness of life that we've been given. I'm going to try to take Matthew 16 and put it in a more contemporary and practical setting. Like any passage of Scripture, I would never say to you, this is what that passage is about, because the Holy Spirit speaks so many different things to us in a passage. Jesus and the disciples, it basically says that they arrive at Caesarea Philippi, which to us just sounds like another place. But actually Caesarea Philippi would have been at the northern edge, so to speak, of Jesus' ministry. He would not go any further than that. And he would have been around tons of kinds of idols and temples and all that kind of stuff, because that particular region has a history that goes back to Joshua. There used to be a temple of Baal worship there back in Joshua's day. If you were to study the region as you go through, when the Greeks, Alexander the Great and all that, when the Greeks arrive, they build a temple there for Pan. So now you can imagine Jesus is looking out. Okay, so there was a time when there was Baal worship going on. There was a time when there was worship of the god Pan that the Greeks worshipped. And then you've got Herod, who decided to build a temple there to Augustus Caesar. So there's another temple there where one of their own, Herod, builds a temple to the Roman emperor who thinks he's the Son of God, calls himself the Son of God. And so Herod, it's a political thing, but it's also a religious thing. It kind of crosses over between the two. And he's got a temple over here. And then you've got Herod Philip, Herod's son, who renames the city, which is where it gets Caesarea Philippi. Part of the city is named after Philip, because he's who he is, Philippi. And the other part is for Caesar. So they literally take the name of it and change it to Caesarea Philippi. I'm saying all that because here's Jesus in this place looking at all this stuff. And there's a lot of it, with temples, political intrigue, wars had taken place, armies came in and the whole thing. You've got this set up. From my perspective, it's looking at the world's value system. And Jesus is standing there looking at the world's value system for over 1,000 years. And it's when he asked the question, who do men, this is the produce of man, so to speak, all this stuff, this is what they've done, what do they say about me? I look at it this way. Here, right now, in the United States, I don't know what you're seeing. And I'm not talking about just what the news says we should see, what you're actually seeing. And I'm not even talking about in the spirit, just what you see around you on a daily basis in terms of man's value system. And we're not picking on people, because we're talking about a system. The question when Jesus asks, who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? He's just classified this whole value system, men, humanity, what they produce, whether it's religion, politics, whatever, this whole thing. Who do they say I am? And then following the answers he gets, we know that then he says, well, who do you say I am? Now, usually we hear that in kind of, well, it's more important what you say than, what they're, that whole thing. And that's great, that's fine. But I find the question to be, what is shouting at you from your surroundings, from where you work, in your neighborhoods, on the television, in the movies, on in the newspapers, what is shouting at us? Something is being screamed all around us. And Jesus is looking at it in Philippi, and it's screaming. It's screaming something. I guess the way I'm looking at it is that the answers that he gets when he says, who do men say that I am? And the answers that he gets shows that there's somewhat of a knowledge of who he is, because they mention Jeremiah and they mention Elijah and John the Baptist. They gravitate towards the prophets because the prophets always did miraculous stuff. So they're recognizing he's doing some outrageous stuff, and they're basically saying they recognize you as one of those prophets. But that's as far as they go. And they also refer to the past. They go into the past to try to develop something of the present, so to speak. In other words, they're looking, they're just observing what Jesus is doing. That's all they are, as observers. Trying to interpret it, if you would, coming up with an interpretation. What does that mean? And that's the best that the world can do that way. That's the best that they can do, is come up with that. But my question is for us today, looking at what's around us, what's screaming at us. I would hope, I've got to believe that we are people of the Spirit and the Word enough that we can perceive what's being said and screamed around us. If we can't, that's scary. If we're not able to decipher the difference between the message that the world is screaming and who we are as representations of another kingdom, of Jesus Christ himself. I know what men are saying. I know what's going on there. But that's not the question. And a lot of times as Christians, we might sit around and we moan about everything when it comes, I read, blah, blah. And that's not the issue. As far as Jesus, that just is not the issue. Got it. The issue is, what is your life screaming in the midst of that? What do you say? What is your representation? Or, maybe nobody in this room, but have people, followers of Christ, become more like the world? Because I don't know what are you talking about? I don't hear anything. Well, then let him who has ears hear what the Spirit of the Lord is saying. We need to get our ears unclogged a bit or something, I don't know. They've got a little bit of knowledge. They've got some interpretations, observations of who Jesus is. But the question is, what do you say in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation? That's what Paul calls his generation. He's very clear. He's not looking at it and saying, they're such nice people. He's not saying that at all. He's saying this is crooked and it's perverse. It's in a mess. And he's not putting them down and saying you're all going to hell. That's not the issue. It's messed up. It's like seriously messed up. That's what Paul's saying. And actually when you read Mark's, I said it's in all three accounts. In Mark, he has Jesus saying something about an adulterous and sinful generation. When he's in the same passage, it's the parallel passage. In other words, there have been things said that are describing the condition of the world. And the challenge is, so what condition are you in? It's kind of like simple, really. What is your condition like? Matthew 22, verses 20 and 21.
And he said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? They said to him, Caesar's. Then he said to them, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's.
It's pretty simple. Looking at money, it's money. Whose picture's on it? Whose image is on you? Give to Caesar. Give him his money. His picture's on it, and give to God. You can't miss the two things that Jesus is saying there. Luke 17:27. Again, it's a passage you're familiar with.
They did not eat, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until that Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all.
Yeah, as it was in the days of Noah, it's going to be like with you. You're just going to carry on and do the stuff. Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's women taking off their clothes on television. Oh, yeah. The guy beat up over here. Oh, yeah. We just got to be at that reception at 2 o'clock. The whole essence of that Noah thing, those are all normal things that people do when you read it. What he's saying is that we know that it's an adulterous, perverse, crooked generation, and the church just keeps, just carry on. Yeah, it's all right. I got mine. I'm okay. I'm not trying to make this hard or difficult or anything. I just think that the passage when Jesus says, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" The word that's used there is anthropos. I was getting anthropology from it. It's a word that's just used for man in general, humanity. What is humanity saying that I, the Son of humanity, the Son of Man? He's not separating himself from it in one respect. He's identifying with it. But he's talking about two different men. Men that men produce and men that God produces. And women, men and women. Humanity. That's what we're talking about, is humanity. The question is asked in Matthew 16. Which humanity are you going to live and represent? It's quite simple. There's a humanity that says this, and there's a new humanity that says this. And the new humanity is the humanity that I have birthed, that this is all about, is a new humanity, a new creation. Behold, all things have become new. This is a new thing. Matthew 16:16.
Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God."
And Peter's right. But he doesn't know what he's talking about. And that's, to be honest with you, all of us are like this. Now we're like this. I'm not even talking about just Peter. He's right. You are the Son of God. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he's got an idea what that means, and he's dead wrong, which is Jesus is going to show him. I think this is the place the church is right now. We think we know what we're talking about. We think we really know Jesus, which is why we get so confused when he doesn't do the things that we think he should. Because we know him so well, instead of saying, well, maybe he's doing things a little differently, and maybe I don't know him as well as I think I do. And maybe he's doing what he does, which he doesn't have to ask me what I think he should do. Maybe I need to grow in my revelation of who he actually is instead of who I want him to be. See, when Peter says, what Peter says, he's exactly right. He's not wrong. He's commended for the revelation that you didn't get this from flesh and blood. You did not get this of men. You got this of your Father, of God. Two different things. Who do men say I am? You didn't get it from them, because they're all wrong. They're all operating out observation and interpretations and everything. You got that from your Father. This is what the new humanity is about. What we get, we said last week, comes out of our relationship. That's where we get what we get from, and that's what we walk out in our lives. Jesus is going to tell them, all of them, what that means, what Peter has just said. But at this point, they don't really know it because he hasn't quite revealed it yet. They don't really know what that means when they call him Messiah. It's sort of like, I bet in this room we have varying degrees of knowledge of how a car operates. I might be one of the least ones in the room because I know very few things about a car. I'll tell you this, the first time I saw a car, probably as a kid, I knew nothing. I knew you get in it, my father drives it, and that's that. Mm-hmm. But through my life, I've grown to understand more and more about vehicles. I've grown in my knowledge of the vehicle. And like I say, even in this room right now, there'd be varying degrees of what a car does and why, when you turn the ignition, whatever. It's like that with Christ. I think we've just kind of said, it's a Toyota. And it gets me where I want to go. So I'm happy. I'm going to heaven, And it's like, but that's not really what it's about. There's a greater revelation. There's an ongoing revelation. Well, as long as it gets me where I'm going, what if your neighbor's not getting where he's going? And you got to know what to do with the car. Now what are you going to do? Oh, never thought about that. And that's the problem. We don't think about those kinds of things. The thing here, Jesus is about to tell them what this actually means, what Messiah is actually about. Because he knows, like we've said in this room several times before, the Jews had an idea of who Messiah was going to be, the way he was going to do things, what he was going to be about. They were dead wrong. And yet, they had all the scriptures, just like we do. I mean, we're in better shape than they were. We carry them around in the binder and this Bible thing. Ongoing revelation. Jesus says, you've got part of it. You've got it right. I am the Messiah. But he's going to go on to explain basically what that means. And I want to say this, that and I've said this before, that revelation of Jesus brings revelation of self. In other words, when Peter has the revelation of who Jesus is, he gives Peter a revelation of who he is. So there's different revelations going on here. There's a revelation, an initial one. There's going to be a greater one Jesus is going to lead them into, and there's also going to be the revelation of who you actually are. All these courses and things that we do, trying to come into greater revelation of who we are, if it's not coming out of what I said last week, being in relationship, the will of God is being in prayer. If it's not coming out of that, you can spend your whole life trying to figure out who you are. I'll tell you what, there's a lot of courses and there's a lot of people and a lot of books and a lot of tapes, everything but the Spirit of God. Everything is there to tell you who you are. And you're a king's kid and this and that. You go on, there's all kinds of stuff. And the place to be is in the closet with Dad. Because out of that place right there, I discover more of who he is, which is what I need more than anything. And the result is he reveals to me who I am. That's kind of the way it works. And then we're able to walk out, so to speak, like we said last week, being in, doing of, it's always with him. It's always a with him kind of thing. Jesus brings a greater revelation to Peter, and he's going to unveil what his plans are for the new humanity that he's birthing. As he says to him, when we've already talked about men and you and, binding and loosing in heaven and earth, he's laying down a description of what the new humanity will look like. It will have authority on earth. That's what binding and loosing is about. He's just saying, you have authority as my son on earth. You're a new humanity. And what you say, heaven will stand behind. That's kind of like the way it has to do with authority. There is a difference between heaven and earth. There is, but I'm building a church. I'm going to do it. Relax. And the gates of hell shall not prevail. So he makes it very clear that there's going to be resistance, but it's not something for us to be afraid of or anything like that. Because you have the victory in that respect. He's unveiling very, very quickly to Peter and to the disciples what this new humanity is about and what it looks like, which kingdom it represents, and why. But he also knows, Jesus knows very clearly, that when Peter says, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God, he's got an idea of what that means. They all do. But they don't really know what that means. So, if we go on to verses 20 and 21.
Then he warned the disciples that they should tell no one that he was the Christ. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and to be killed, and to be raised up on the third day.
He tells them to tell no one. And if you think about that, it's kind of, well, why would they not tell anybody? Because of what Peter's going to say in the next verse. In other words, Jesus knows they've got an idea of what Messiah is about. If you go out and tell everybody that he's the Messiah, they're all going to think that this is what's going to happen. And he goes on to say, but that's not what's going to happen. Actually, I'm going into Jerusalem. I'm going to suffer. They're going to do this. They're going to do that. I'm going to die. I'm going to be crucified. I'm going to be raised the third day, the whole thing. That is outside his remit. That is not who Jesus is. This is where they're all coming. That is just not Jesus. I know it's not Jesus. Be careful. Be careful. Please be careful. Because a lot of things that we're looking at, we're saying that can't be God. It probably is, to be honest with you. And the things that we say, oh, that's God. Be careful. Deception is a very powerful thing when we think God is in something and he's not. Because we see certain things. Those are the fingerprints of God. Jesus knows all that. He says, listen, at this point, I mean, they're not even going to receive what he's saying about suffering and dying. And they're going to go out and advertise that he's Messiah. And it's false advertising is what it is. They're promoting something that he's not. And he said, don't do that. Don't go tell anybody. Because they're convinced on the prosperity gospel. Don't go out and tell, because then they're going to think that everybody's going to be healed. He gives them a description of what he's going to go through as Messiah. In fact, it's not just a description of what he's going to go. He says what I must. He uses the word must go through. Suffering is a must. Death is a must. These are musts for Jesus. But that does not fit Messiah portfolio. No, Messiah is going to come in on a white horse. He's going to have an army. He's going to wipe out the Romans. We're going to establish our Jewish empire like in the days of King David. But even greater than that, we're going to cover the whole earth as the waters cover the sea. I mean, they had this is what they thought. And Jesus is saying, no. My kingdom's not of this world. That's not the way it's going to be. But that's what they think. They had the scriptures, Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, Zechariah 12. There's tons of scriptures about the suffering Messiah. It's not like you got to find one verse in one chapter in one book someplace. It's all over the place, but it's so easy to not see when you're not looking for it, because I'm looking for something else. I'm looking for my bills to be paid. I need scriptures on prosperity. That's what I'm looking for. I'm not trying to be rude about this, and God does prosper us. Please don't misunderstand me. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying when we get tunnel vision, when we make Jesus into something much smaller than he actually is, when we make the new humanity something smaller than it actually is, when we reduce it to I'm saved and going to heaven, then we're missing the major emphasis of what the new humanity and what this Son of Man, this Son of Anthropos is about. Because he's really trying to show us there is a humanity, but there is a son of the Son of Man, of the Son of Anthropos, of the new humanity that I'm creating that's different. They had the scriptures, but they basically heard what they wanted to hear as of men. There's of men and there's of God. They heard what they wanted to hear of men. Like I said, when you're in the closet with Dad, you're of the Father, you're of God, and that's what he's talking about here. He's going to actually clarify it even more. In all fairness, this is the first time that he's talking about his suffering and his death. So this is the first time they've heard it. And he recognizes that. He hasn't been preaching about the fact that he's going to suffer and die. We get one revelation. Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God, and now he's going to bring them to the next revelation. And guess what? I'm going to tell you what that means. I'm going to reveal it to you. As the Father revealed that, now I'm the Son, and I'm going to reveal something greater. I'm going to suffer. And if you're going to be like me, you're going to suffer. If I have to die, you don't have to go to a cross, but there's going to have to be things that you die to. He's being as honest and upfront as he can about the identification of the new humanity. Last week I had said that there were several, I thought the atonement were a bit top heavy on the atonement. That whenever we're presented with what is the work of Christ, our default is Jesus Christ, went to the cross and died for my sins so I could, that's our default. Without recognizing everything else that goes along with it. We talked last week, whether we see it as everything comes from the atonement or not is not the issue. If we can't list the other things that go, if that's all we see is that Jesus Christ came to earth and he died on the cross and so while cleansed from our, if that's all we see, then we are a sad people. How can you engage the new humanity if that's all you think it is? I mean, think about that. If we're supposed to be a representation of Jesus, but we haven't a clue what that means, or of a kingdom, and we don't know what the kingdom is, or in right relationship with it, we don't know what that is. We're experiencing none of these things. We've had no revelation on any of it, and yet we're here, and Jesus is saying, so what do you say about I don't know. Am I supposed to say something? It wasn't just about the cross. It was restoration of relationships, spiritual sight restored, a revelation of love, judgment on the ruler of this world and sin. The Holy Spirit was given, an example of a son. I mean, to me, that's one of the most powerful ones right there. Is now I know what a son is, and I wouldn't have known without him. And so I can allow the same Spirit that was in Jesus Christ as the Son of Man, representing the new humanity. I see me, that I never saw before. I saw my earthly father, who was a great guy, a bit abusive at times, just because he was like his dad, who was like his dad. You know, you just do what you see, don't you? The way you're raised and everything. You just get on with what the tools you've been given that can only build an of men perspective on things. And Jesus is saying, leave those tools behind, because I got new tools for you that are going to create a new humanity. But it's just like a baby grows. You're going to grow. You're going to grow in your image and likeness. You're going to grow in this new life. And it's dependent on an ongoing revelation. If you're stuck, please don't cling on to me. Let me go so I can grow. Because if I grow, you can grow. Do you see that? That's what he's saying. If you get stuck in a rut, he's saying we need an ongoing revelation. And he starts sharing with them about his suffering and death. This is part of it. And Peter, as we know, we're going to read in a minute, he immediately rejects it. Jesus says he must, like he did at 12 years old. We said it last week. Did you not know that I must be about my Father? He used the word must there at 12 years old. He knew what he must. I must. In fact, it was funny because this last week, Carol said she had a little bit of a revelation last week when we were talking from John 4:34, when he said, my food is to do the will of my Father and to finish his work. And it suddenly hit her like it never hit her before. Food's a pretty important thing. I mean, none of us in this room can live without it, let's put it that way. And he's saying, unless I'm in that place with my Father, where I'm receiving from him and I'm hearing him, and we're just involved in this place of pleasure and delight, without that, I'm a dead man. Because nothing can come out of my life without that. And he's saying here, I must. He recognizes what's come out of that place with Dad. I must be in my Father and my Father in me. I must. He says a lot. He says must a few times, Jesus, when he talks about I must work the works of him who sent me. I must do it. That's a powerful word, must. I don't know how many things we would use the word must for. I think we might use it more in physical things. I must get some rest. I must eat and get something to drink. In our spiritual walk, does anybody have any musts? Do we look at it that way? I absolutely must. I would absolutely die if I didn't. Now, I'm not trying to be, I'm just throwing stuff out, aren't I? Because that's what we do here. We try to see ourselves in a position of receiving the Word of God from God in the Spirit, that we might walk out of here. And when he says, so how do you see this? And what is your life saying? Because I'll tell you what, when Jesus is at Caesarea Philippi, and he's standing there, and he's facing all this stuff. I wrote down this morning, 15, 16, depending on how you count them, conditions of men, if you would, that are in our face right now. Here's what I wrote down just because you'd all go, oh yeah, of course. Terrorism. It's something that's facing us that God is not trying to terrorize us. And anybody who tells you they are, well, this is please give it a break. That fear, it says quite clearly that God does not torment us. There's no torment in fear. This is not God trying to get the churches there. This is something of men, and even further of Satan, which we're going to talk about in a minute. War. Don't kid yourself into thinking because you'll have wars and rumors of war that that's God's plan. That's not God's plan. That's man's plan. That's how you do things. Anyway, poverty. Poverty is in our face, and that is not of God. I can't get off on anyone. I want to do injustice, which has to do with law. There's injustice all around. We face it every day. In the workplace, so many different situations. The question is, so what do we say? And I'm not talking about going to Washington and that's not what I'm talking about. It's just in general. I mean, we spent some weeks talking about, is God violent? What does the church, what does the new humanity have to say about the old humanity and the way they do things and how they're being influenced of Satan, which is what we're going to see in a minute with Peter. He rebukes Jesus, Jesus rebukes Satan. If we ever get that through our heads, Peter he's rebuking Jesus, and Jesus doesn't go after Peter. He understands the influence that has perverted and has polluted the minds and the hearts of people. He gets it. Jesus gets it. He's not fighting a flesh and war battle here. He's not going to have it out with Peter. He knows it's a spiritual battle. Crime, lawlessness is all around us. One of the things that is, Carol knows if you brought her in here, that really, really bothers me is how insensitive we're becoming, and then we're getting numb. We're getting numb to the crime and the violence around us. We're being anesthetized. Well, that's just the way it is. We're getting consumed by consumers, basically. Immorality, you said, whether it's personal, whether it's falling prey personally, or the whole entertainment industry. There are some of us in here that can remember when hearing the word hell on television. You would never hear that. Are you kidding me? You would never hear damn or hell. You wouldn't hear those words on television. And look at where we are now. Now, and I'm saying we, because I think that all of us to some extent need to kind of turn the switch here a bit on, but what do you say about these things? Sexism, racism, it's prejudice. I probably spend half my day throwing up the way people treat each other because of their color or their sex. It's awful. Broken families, child abuse, the divorce rates, obsession with physical beauty, this lie that, you've got to look a certain way. These are all of men and of an enemy that wants to destroy the soul of man, which is where Jesus is going. What good is it if you gain all of that and you lose your soul, your life in the process? That's where he's going down the road here. We're not going to finish this today. Abusing the planet. We don't even think about it. In fact, there's a lot of churches that would teach, well, it's all here for us to enjoy. So let's just go ahead and rape the thing, and so what if we kill animals violently? Got to get them killed quickly. There's all kinds, the abuse of the planet and what God has given us. Drug abuse. I don't care if it's legal or illegal. Mental, emotional illnesses, depression. All kinds of bondages and addictions. The lack of love, whether it be for one another or for God. Honoring, which just means to value. To value anybody or anything outside of ourselves. These are just, I was writing these down over breakfast this morning as they were just popping into my head. I'm thinking, these are all the things. Jesus is looking at Caesarea Philippi and all this stuff. This is not new stuff, really. He's looking at all of it in his generation and the generations to come. And he's saying, I get it. I know what they're saying and where they got it from. But I'm birthing a new humanity that's going to look at it like me. That's not going to sit around and write lists over breakfast and say, isn't it awful? But is going to have a representation someplace into these things that says, I represent a new humanity that you belong to, actually. The way has been made for you to enter into this new humanity, to become a son of Anthropos, a son of man. Peter's response, Jesus says, I must. Jesus goes from, you got that revelation from Dad? Now I'm going to add to it. It involves suffering and death. And Peter has a response, verses 22 and 23.
Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan, you are a stumbling block to me, for you are not setting your mind on God's interest, but man's.
Of God, of man. Who do men say I am? What is of man? What is of God? This is what Jesus is on about. It's kind of interesting that Jesus tells him, number one, he says, I must do this. I must do it. I must. And Peter says, no, you don't. I would say to all of us in this room, when we've got a must from God, when we see something that must, and we're getting these notions, I don't have to. I'm not trying to say we don't have any accountability, but Jesus recognizes where that comes from. The influence of the enemy and the inroads that he's already made into. He says he literally turns and looks back at Peter. He might be looking at Peter, but he's talking to an enemy that has influenced him into thinking that the musts of God, did God really mean that? Did God say? Is that what he really means by, that? All of this kind of stuff, the influence of the enemy, Jesus breaks it down into two things. You're either the things of God or of men. There's a lot of room, wiggly room in between there. Jesus told them the religious leaders would reject him, and what is Peter doing? As soon as he says to him, you don't have to do that, that's a rejection of what Jesus just said he's here to do. He's just rejected him. But he thinks he's doing a good thing. Remember what Jesus said about the religious leaders? They'll kill you and they think they're doing a good thing. They think they're representing God. Peter's onto something here. You don't have to do that. Why? Because my paradigm of Messiah doesn't work like that. My paradigm of Messiah, who I say you are, I thought I asked you a moment ago, who do men say I am? I thought you came up with the right revelation. Well, he did come up with the right revelation, but he came up with the wrong meaning of what that revelation is. So we look at him and we say, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. What does that mean? I'm afraid to say. I'm not really sure. Totally. I've got some ideas of what that means. All these denominational splits, 33,000 denominational splits, have all happened because somebody's got the fast track and somebody else thought, I know what God means by that. Well, I know God. I know it. Everything is I know. Yeah, to the point where we are so weak. You would have thought at this point, after 2,000 years, the representation of the new humanity on earth would be so powerful a dynamic. We'd be praying together, worshiping together, going out together, funding each other, whatever that might mean. Because we'd be in a new thing happening. We'd be in a new thing, not the old thing. If you want to enter a new humanity, you better let go of the old humanity. Peter hears suffering and death and says no. Now, I'm not picking on Peter. Because anybody in this room, if I talked about suffering and death and you said, yeah, bring it on, I'd say there is something seriously wrong with you. Or if you heard about a loved one who was suffering, there's no way you would say, that's great, thank you very much, I'm so glad to hear that. No. When you hear someone you love is suffering, our response is no. No. What I'm saying is that the human response, when we say no to suffering, that's God's response. God says the same thing. That's part of Jesus' mandate, is he's going to suffer and die so you don't have to, in one respect, for the atonement. There is an element of suffering that we go through. He's going to tell them what it is. If you want to follow me, this is what you're going to have to suffer. Hello? But it's not the same suffering I'm going to go through. Although some of you will go through that. You'll go before magistrates and you'll go before religious leaders and they'll kill you. You're going to be martyred. There's going to be degrees of suffering. Love's response says no to suffering. We're not having it. We pray for each other. We lay hands on each other for healing. We follow Jesus in that respect. But also in the context of what Peter is saying, which is the influence of the enemy, is a rejection of greater revelation. And I want to challenge anybody in here. I'm going to ask you to pray. If you've got a thing that's happening where, if you've ever heard, and some people teach it, we've got all the revelation we need right here. Well, somebody better tell everybody who's lived the last 2,000 years, who's followed Jesus Christ, that has received greater revelation and brought it. It doesn't change who he is, it changes who we are. That's what the greater revelation is about, an ongoing greater revelation of who he is. It's the enemy who says, you're okay. You don't need to know him any more than you know him. You don't need to spend more time with him. This guy's a little bit of a wacko up there in front of his little camera. You don't need this stuff. You're okay. It's a demonic message. It cuts right at the heart of who we are, of what Jesus is, what he has said. And he's made it clear what the musts are. We must have an ongoing greater revelation. That's what he's presenting. And the thing that steps in the way is our mindsets, basically. Martha, Martha, you're worried about so many things. Might as well have said of men. There's so many things that concern you. And there's one thing that's needful. And Mary's chosen it. To be with me in this place. The rich young ruler. Tons and tons of things of men. And I'm coming up short. What is it about? Yeah, because you got to get rid of all the things of men. Get it all away. Dump it. And the same thing he says here, he's going to say about following him. And come follow me. And you'll have the one thing that you lack. Spending time with me. There's a greater revelation. Peter's revelation was supposed to be a rock to build on. That's what it was supposed to be. But his mindset and his openness to an ongoing revelation is a must that he doesn't see yet. And Jesus is very tenderly walking him through it. The rock is supposed to get bigger. The rock must get bigger. In Daniel 2, it's Nebuchadnezzar's dream, when he has that dream of the image, and he wants his wise men, magicians, whatever, to tell him what the dream means. But he won't tell them what the dream is. They have to tell him what the dream is and then give him the interpretation. And his guys all are like, you have to go back and read it, it's great. His guy's like, well, nobody can do that. So, well, somebody better. You're supposed to be you're supposed to be able to have these things of God, so to speak. Get in your prayer closet. He'll tell you what my dream is. He doesn't say all that. He's basically telling them, you're either going to tell me my dream and its interpretation, or you're all dead men. And they can't do it. They haven't a clue what his dream is. And so he starts wiping out. He starts killing all of his magicians and wise men in Babylon. And that's going to put Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that's going to put them, they're in the same category, basically. So they appeal to Daniel and say, can you do anything about this? And he basically says, no, but God can. See, Daniel knows that if you're in the place here, then you receive from God and you have something with him to take out and to walk through. That's how it works. I can't do it. That's where Daniel's coming from. But Daniel tells the king about God. God's a revealer. He brings revelation. He's got greater revelation. He has an ongoing revelation. He has a greater revelation that I can tap into. All I have to do is ask. So I'm going to go into my prayer closet and I'm going to find out what this is about. Just be patient, king. Because he's not going to tell God, you got to tell me. He's just going to go spend time with God. Sure enough, he spends time with God. God tells Daniel what the dream is and gives him the interpretation. Comes back before the king. While the king's eyes are rolling back in his head that Daniel's this great guy, he's saying, no, it's not me. I want you to get this clear. It has nothing to do with me. The only thing that has to do with me is that I'm a representation of the new humanity. I have been made anew. I've been born again, whatever words you want to... There's something... This is not the same kind of humans as you just wiped out. This is Daniel. And he says, what you saw at night, you were laying on your bed. And you were... I mean, he lays it out there. It's beautiful. You were laying and you were thinking about what the future holds in store. That alone, you would have thought the king would be like, yeah, how'd you know that? Well, God told me. And he told me that you saw an image whose head was of gold and whose shoulders and chest was made of silver, and As you move down the body, you got to the middle section, it was made of bronze, and then the legs were made of iron, and you got to the feet, and the feet were made of iron and clay. And at this point, he's got the king's attention. And then he proceeds to tell him that the head, the gold, represents Nebuchadnezzar, and all the parts of the body represents the kingdoms that would be following him in the future. And what would happen when the rock that was going to be cut out of a mountain without hands. You saw a mountain and you saw a rock. And somehow this rock was being cut out of a mountain, but there were no hands involved. It just was something supernatural was happening. And he lays this out to him. Verses 34 and 35. If somebody has Daniel 2, verses 34 and 35.
Thou sawest till that a stone was cut without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broke to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing's floor. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth.
Stone's got to get bigger. Rock's got to get bigger. It's got to. God said so. It's got to. It's going to. I mean, I'm going back that far. I'm going back nearly 3,000 years here. The rock has got to get bigger. This kingdom and the revelation of the kingdom in Jesus Christ is too small. And right now, we walk around from day to day in the face of terrorism, war, immorality, all kinds of, we just walk around. It's got to get bigger. But the way it's going to get bigger is through us. The word, the truth, must become our mindsets. Our mindsets have got to be of God. And that doesn't say that we're thinking about God all day long, but the way we look at everything. Are we getting our points of view and the way we look at things and what we accept? Where are we getting it from? Are we being lulled to sleep in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation? Are we becoming crooked and perverse, basically? In the midst of all this kind of stuff, it's a concern. In this passage, Jesus is very lovingly making it clear that there's an influence of the enemy on the human condition, that there's a human response that Jesus is fine with, because actually it's a godly response to suffering and death. Death is going to go. We still experience it, but it's going to go. It's the last enemy to be defeated and gone. We know that, right? And suffering. These are things that God is saying no to. The human response is a godly one. There's not a problem there. But this idea that Jesus is presenting, the new humanity, it's a very challenging question from Jesus. What do we see around us? What is man saying? What is the enemy saying? And what do you say? Yeah, and what do you say? That's his question in the passage. I'll finish it next week. I think for today we can just walk away with, you are a son of man. That's what we are, a son of Anthropos. But it's representing the Son of Man, the new humanity, not the old. And when we're talking, it doesn't have to be with words. It's like, what do you say? There's a lot represented in what do you say. What does your life say? All I'm saying is there are things in our lives that speak really loudly. That does not make sense in the of men world. There's no slot for it. And that should be the norm of the new humanity. That's all I'm saying. We can go around the room and look at all the different things that we're facing and see immediately that there's a new humanity. There's a person that Christ has made us. A new being. His image and likeness in every situation. And we're challenged with that. So what are you going to do? What are you going to say? What are you going to be? It's just a question.